6 months ago, Verity Lorne ate every meal of her life in a house of 40 rooms standing upright in the kitchen because the family she served did not permit the governess at any table that bore their name. Tonight, every guest at Caldwell Park rose to their feet when she entered the dining room, not because they were required to, because the Duke of Fenmore stood first, and where he led, 300 years of English precedent followed without question. She walked to the chair he held, and she sat, and the room did not breathe until she was settled. And not one of them, not a single one of the faces she had learned to make herself invisible in front of, dared speak before she did. Welcome to the Governess Hour. She was beneath notice. That was the point of her position. To be useful and unseen. To move through a great house like furniture that occasionally answered questions. And then one man decided she was the only thing in the house worth looking at. This is the Governess Hour, where the women's society discards become the ones the most powerful men in England cannot live without. Before we begin, where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I read every single one, and I love seeing this community span the globe. Tonight's story is about a woman named Verity Lorne, governess to the Ashby household of Larkmoor, Yorkshire, for 3 years and 4 months. 3 years of being told, in every language available to women of property and contempt, that she did not belong at the table. Not the family table, where she was obviously forbidden. Not the servants' table, either, where they resented her pretensions to gentility. She belonged nowhere, and to no one, which is precisely what Lady Ashby intended. What Lady Ashby had not accounted for was the guest she had invited to her autumn house party. She had not accounted for the fact that Warwick Brambleton, the Duke of Fenmore, England's most feared and least understood man, had been watching, not for weeks, for years. Let me take you back to October of 1857, to the moors of Yorkshire, to a house that smelled of money and cruelty in equal measure, and to the evening everything began to tip. The first time the Duke of Fenmore saw Verity Lorne, she was carrying a tray. It was not, he would later think, a remarkable introduction. Trays were common in England. Governesses were common in England. Women who moved through great houses with the particular economy of a person who had learned not to take up space. Those were common too. And yet he stood in the east corridor of Larkmoor Hall, waiting for his host to finish a conversation that had gone on 17 minutes, longer than any conversation with Gerald Ashby deserved. And he watched this woman cross the entrance hall below with a supper tray, and he felt something in his chest do something he had no useful framework for. She was not hurrying. That was the first thing. Every servant in a house hurried. Motion was defense. It communicated industry, purpose, the performance of indispensability. But she walked with the tray balanced against her forearm, as though the dining room above was not the only room in England that mattered, as though the clock above the entrance hall did not exist, as though she had, for this particular moment, claimed some interior sovereignty that the house could not reach. He watched her until she turned the corner at the far end of the hall. Then he returned to Gerald Ashby's voice, which was still producing sentences about the shooting, and he made the sounds of a man who was listening. Now, to understand what Verity's presence in that hall actually meant, what it cost, and what it risked, it is important to understand what a governess was in 1857 England. She occupied a position that Victorian society had invented without having the decency to support. She was educated enough to teach the children of the aristocracy French watercolour and deportment. She was genteel enough to know which fork to use, but she had neither the legal standing of the family she served, nor the professional protection of the servants she lived alongside. She could not eat with the servants, who resented her pretensions to a class she could no longer claim. She could not eat with the family, who found her presence at their table socially inconvenient. She existed in between, and in between is a very cold place to live. Her salary was £26 a year, less than the cook. The cook, at least, was permitted to sit. Verity had come to Larkmoor 3 years and 4 months ago, following the death of her father, a clergyman whose modest income had been entirely absorbed by the modest debts he had accumulated in his final years. She had been 23 years old, highly educated, entirely without capital, and possessing the particular quality that makes bad situations worse. She was acutely aware of all of the above. She had her room, which was cold. She had her meals, which she took in the schoolroom or standing in the kitchen, depending on the mood of the cook that day. She had her pupils, which consisted of the Ashby daughters, Rosalba, 12, who was clever and treated her with genuine warmth, and Nella, 9, who was not yet clever enough to know how to be deliberately unkind, and so defaulted to her mother's example. And she had the awareness, constant and close as weather, that her position rested on a single document, a letter of character from Lady Ashby, without which she was entirely unemployable, and which Lady Ashby had made clear in the 3 separate conversations that Verity kept count of could be withheld for any reason Lady Ashby chose. This is what a dismissal without reference meant in 1857, not simply unemployment. The reference letter was the key to every respectable household in England. Without it, a woman of Verity's education had no claim on any position above that of a factory girl or a laundress. And Verity had read enough newspaper accounts of what factory work did to a woman's hands in the first winter to know that she could not afford to look Lady Ashby in the eye for too long. She had not looked Lady Ashby in the eye for 3 years. She had kept her gaze at a point slightly left of the woman's face, which conveyed attention without confrontation, and she had said, "Yes, my lady, and I shall attend to it, my lady, and very well, my lady," and she had walked away from every conversation still employed. It was a Tuesday in October when the house party began. 10 guests arrived before supper. The 11th arrived 2 hours after supper had been cleared, because the Duke of Fenmore did not arrange his travel around his hostess's dinner schedule, and everyone in England knew it. Verity knew it too. She knew it the way she knew everything about the guests of Larkmoor, from below, from the corridor outside the drawing-room, where she could hear enough of the conversation to anticipate tomorrow's schedule, from the servants' gossip, which she was not invited to participate in, but could hear through the kitchen wall, from the newspapers that Lady Ashby finished and left on the hall table, and which Verity retrieved each morning before the footman could discard them. She knew that Warwick Brambleton, 8th Duke of Fenmore, was 40,000 a year. She knew that he had served 2 years in the Crimea before his uncle's death made him a duke and recalled him to the responsibilities of his title. She knew that he was unmarried, that 3 seasons' worth of debutantes had failed to secure him, and that society attributed this variously to coldness, to grief, to unusual standards, and to a rumour about a woman in Paris that Verity considered unlikely, but noted without dismissing. What she did not know, because no newspaper had reached to it, was that the Duke of Fenmore had attended 15 social events in the past 3 years, at which a Miss Verity Lorne had been employed in some peripheral capacity, that he had made inquiries on 3 of those occasions as to her employment history, that he had read in a letter from his solicitor in Leeds a detailed account of the Lorne family circumstances, the nature of her father's debts, and the specific terms under which she was currently employed, and that he had accepted Gerald Ashby's invitation to the autumn house party at Larkmoor, not because he had any interest in the shooting, but because Lady Ashby had a habit of cruelty that had reached even his ears, and he had decided, somewhere around the 4th month of the 2nd year, that he had watched long enough. He arrived at 11 in the evening. Verity was in the schoolroom. She was sitting with Rosalba, who had a cough that had kept her from sleep since 8 o'clock, and who was too old to be comforted by a nursemaid, and too young to be comfortable being ill without company. They were reading aloud from a volume of Norse mythology, because Rosalba had a talent for the dramatic and liked the Valkyries. And Verity had chosen stories in which capable women made decisions, because she believed this was the only kind of education that mattered in the long run, and no one paid enough attention to the schoolroom to object. She heard the carriage. She heard the particular quality of the entry hall when a significant arrival occurred. The different timbre of voices, the way the footsteps changed. She did not go to the window. She sat with Rosalba and read until the child fell asleep against her shoulder, and then she carried the lamp to the far side of the room and sat alone and listened to the house settle around a presence she could already feel without having seen its source. She told herself this was fancy. She was a practical woman. She did not indulge fancy. She was lying, and she knew it. She first saw him the following morning. Now, I want to pause here, because I need you to understand the geography of Larkmoor before this scene makes its full impact. The house was organised, as most great Yorkshire houses were, with the family's morning room on the south face, overlooking the formal garden, and the servants' corridor running parallel behind it. The governess occupied a narrow band between these 2 worlds. She might be summoned to the morning room for instructions, but she would use the servants' entrance to get there, and she would leave the same way. And under no circumstances was she to linger in any room where the family might want to sit without the reminder of her existence. This is the economy of exclusion, not dramatic, not visible to anyone standing outside it. Just the 1,000 small spatial decisions that told a woman every hour of every day that she was tolerated, not welcomed, that her presence was at best neutral and at worst an inconvenience to be managed. Verity had become expert in the management of herself. She was crossing the east corridor, the servants' route between the schoolroom and the morning room, where Lady Ashby had summoned her for the day's instructions, when she came around the corner and nearly walked into him. She stopped. She had the reflexes of a woman who had learned to stop and recalibrate very quickly. He was taller than she had expected. That was her first thought, which was not useful. He was looking at her, not with the pleasant blankness that employers' guests typically deployed toward the governess, the expression that said, "I know you are here, and have elected to treat you as furniture," but with something so direct that she had to resist the urge to look behind her, to confirm there was no one else he could be looking at. There was no one else. "Miss Lorne," he said. She had not given him her name. "Your Grace," she said. He was silent for a moment, studying her face with a particular quality of attention that she could not categorize. Not the assessment of a man looking at a woman. Something more careful than that. Something that felt less like evaluation and more like recognition. "You were in the entrance hall last night," he said, with the tray. She had not known he was watching. She kept this off her face. "I was bringing supper to Miss Rosalba," she said. "She was not well. How is she this morning?" Verity regarded him. No guest at Larkmoor had ever asked after Rosalba's health. Rosalba was 12 years old and a governess's concern, and therefore, as far as the adult population of the house party was concerned, entirely outside the category of interesting. "Better," she said. "Thank you, Your Grace." He nodded. He stood aside to let her pass. She passed. She did not look back. But she was aware of him behind her, the way you are aware of a fire in a room. Not from sight, not even from sound, but from the alteration in the temperature of everything. He was, she told herself, simply a man. She had dealt with men before. She dealt with Gerald Ashby 3 times a week, which was more than enough practice in the management of men who outranked her. This was not. She understood in the portion of herself she did not allow to speak in polite company, anything like Gerald Ashby. Lady Ashby's morning instructions were what they always were during a house party. A comprehensive inventory of everything. Verity was not to do. She was not to enter any room currently occupied by guests without being summoned. She was not to speak to guests unless directly addressed, and even then to keep her response brief. She was not to attend any communal meal, which went without saying, and yet Lady Ashby said it. Every party, because the saying of it was part of the point. She was to keep the children available for display in the drawing room between 4 and 5 o'clock, when they were decorative, and otherwise keep them out of the way. "The Duke of Fenmore is joining us," Lady Ashby said, not looking up from her correspondence. "He is unmarried, and Millicent Forbes has made very clear her interest in that direction. So you will ensure the girls are at their most presentable for the afternoon display. I want no coughing from Rosalba." A pause, "and stay out of his way. Men like Fenmore do not come to Yorkshire to be reminded that such things as governesses exist," Verity said. "Yes, my lady," and withdrew. She walked the servants' corridor, and she counted, as she had taken to doing in difficult moments, the number of days remaining until Rosalba's 17th birthday, which was when Rosalba would no longer need a governess, and Verity would need a reference, and the entire careful structure of her survival would require dismantling and rebuilding somewhere else. 612 days, that was manageable. She had managed worse arithmetic. What she had not calculated was the Duke of Fenmore, because you cannot calculate something you have not yet understood. The house party's first dinner occurred that evening, which Verity did not attend. She ate in the schoolroom with Rosalba, who was permitted to dine upstairs at 12 years old, and did so with the satisfaction of the recently ill, who have recovered faster than anyone expected. Rosalba wanted to know about the guests. "There are 10 of them," Verity said. "Your parents, usual set, mostly. Forbeses, Colonel Niles and his wife, Lord and Lady Prentice, and a Mr. Drummond, who is something in Parliament. And the Duke?" Verity served the soup. "Yes," she said, "and the Duke, Mrs. Peake says he's terrifying," Rosalba said. Mrs. Peake was the cook, who had opinions about everyone. She says, he made a man apologize to his own butler in front of a room full of people last season for speaking to him rudely. She says his eyes are like... Rosalba considered the vocabulary available to a 12-year-old. Like when there's no storm yet, but you can feel one coming. Verity thought about the corridor. She thought about him standing aside to let her pass. "Eat your soup," she said. Downstairs, in the dining room that Verity had never sat in, the dinner was proceeding as dinners at Larkmoor proceeded, expensively, loudly, and with the particular social energy of people who were all performing the same fiction of ease. The Duke of Fenmore was not performing. He was seated at Lady Ashby's right, because that was where his rank required him to sit, and he was watching the room with the patience of a man who has learned that watching is the most efficient tool available. He had established, in the first 40 minutes of the evening, the following: that Gerald Ashby drank more than he appeared to at first, that Lady Ashby kept a very specific kind of watch on the door to the servants' corridor, and that Millicent Forbes's mother had positioned her daughter so that her laugh would carry specifically to his end of the table. He filed all of this away. "Your Grace," said Lady Ashby, turning to him with the brightness she reserved for men whose approval she wanted, "I hope you are finding Larkmoor comfortable." "Very," he said. "We are a happy house." She said it the way people say things they believe will become true, if said with enough confidence. "Though we are always glad of company, country life can be quiet." "Country life suits me, of course," she smiled. "I understand you have some interest in the neighbouring estates. I had heard you were looking. One hears many things." He picked up his wine. "The girls seem well, your elder particularly." A very small pause crossed Lady Ashby's face. "Rosalba," she said. "Yes. Her governess keeps her well occupied, I suppose. We have had a very capable woman this year." "This year," he said. "She has been with us 3 years," Lady Ashby said, slightly more carefully. "4," he said. 3 years and 4 months. The pause was longer this time. "You are very well informed, Your Grace." "I make it a habit," he said pleasantly, "to know the particulars of households I visit." He returned to his wine. Lady Ashby turned to Colonel Niles on her left. The Duke of Fenmore continued eating his dinner, and continued watching the door to the servants' corridor, and continued adding to the total. Now, it is important to understand what the system he was working within actually was, because what he was planning was not merely personal. It operated through the precise machinery of social power as it existed in 1857 England, where a duke's word carried the weight of a small government. A duke controlled, directly or indirectly, the social invitations his circle received. He controlled lending, patronage, business connections, property valuations. He could make a man's name or unmake it. He could not make anyone do anything by law. But he had spent 20 years understanding the difference between law and reality, and in reality, the law was the least of it. Gerald Ashby needed 3 things: his parliamentary seat, his 2 largest mortgages, and his club membership. The Duke of Fenmore had known this for 4 months, and had spent those months ensuring that he was in a position to address all 3 simultaneously, in the event it became necessary. He had not yet decided if it would become necessary. He had decided he needed to see Larkmoor for himself. The next morning, Verity was in the library. She went there on Tuesday and for Friday mornings, between 8 and 10, because Lady Ashby was at her correspondence, and the children were with their music teacher, and no one needed the governess. And the library was the only room in the house where she could think. The housekeeper had given her tacit permission, years ago, in the way housekeepers gave tacit permission to things they found reasonable but could not officially sanction. She was reading Tocqueville, which she had found between a volume on game management and a bound collection of sermons, and which she suspected had been purchased by some intellectually ambitious Ashby ancestor and never opened. She was 3 chapters in, and finding it remarkably useful for understanding the architecture of social control, which seemed pertinent. She heard the door. She kept her eyes on the page. "Miss Lorne," said the Duke of Fenmore. She closed the book, which was a reflex, and then opened it again.
because she had been sitting in this library on Tuesday and Friday mornings for 3 years, and she had done nothing wrong.
He was looking at the book. Tocqueville, he said. Yes. She kept her voice at its usual register, which was the one she had developed for conversations that required her to be simultaneously present and invisible. Which section? The one on the nature of equality in democratic societies. He came further into the room. This was not, she thought, a man who waited for invitations. He crossed to the shelves on the far wall, which contained the most serious part of the collection, and scanned them with the ease of someone who was entirely comfortable in libraries and entirely indifferent to the social implications of his presence in this one. Lady Ashby knows you come here, he said. It was not a question. The housekeeper is aware, Verity said. He turned. He looked at her directly, the way he had looked at her in the corridor. That is not what I asked. She held the look this time. No, she said. She does not know. He returned to the shelves. He pulled out a volume, she could not see which, and stood with it in his hands. How long have you been in this house, Miss Lorne? 3 years and 4 months, she said. His back was to her, but she heard the very small shift in his breathing. You are precise. In my position, she said, precision is a survival skill. He turned again. He sat, which surprised her, in the chair across the reading table from hers. And he opened the book in his hands, and he read. He did not speak again. He did not explain his presence, or apologize for it, or make any of the social adjustments she was accustomed to people making when they found themselves unexpectedly sharing a room with the governess. She looked at her Tocqueville. She read the same paragraph 4 times. It was the most comfortable she had been in a room at Larkmoor in 3 years and 4 months, and she did not know what to do with that. She found out on the 3rd day. Lady Ashby held a luncheon in the garden, which was October cold but visually impressive, and which had been designed around the assumption that 12 guests gathered on a lawn in their best coats, made for the kind of tableau that society would discuss approvingly. Verity was not at the luncheon. She was watching it from the schoolroom window, which overlooked the formal garden, because Rosalba had asked her to describe who was wearing what. And this was the kind of task she could perform while simultaneously marking Nella's French exercises. The woman in the green, Rosalba said, pressing her face to the glass, is Miss Forbes. She's been next to the Duke every time Mama can arrange it. Sit down, Verity said. He keeps looking toward the house. Verity did not look up from Nella's French. Rosalba. He is, though, Rosalba said. She was not given to invention. She was given to observation, which was what made her genuinely interesting. He's been doing it all morning. Not at the house exactly, toward our window. Come away from the glass, Verity said. Rosalba came and sat. She regarded Verity with the evaluation of a 12-year-old who has spent 3 years learning to read a woman very precisely.
I think you should know, Rosalba said, that whatever Mama says about the Duke, I don't think it's true. I don't know what your mother says about the Duke, Verity said, which was technically accurate in the sense that she had not been directly told, and profoundly inaccurate in the sense that she could guess very precisely. She says he's looking for a wife with connections, Rosalba said. She says he is practical about marriage, and that sentiment is not a consideration for men of his standing. She paused. But he doesn't look at Miss Forbes at all. He looks at the house. Verity marked a conjugation error in Nella's exercise and said nothing. I just thought you should know, Rosalba said. The incident at dinner that evening was not, in the long scheme of things, the worst thing Lady Ashby had done, but it was the first one he saw.
It happened because of a miscommunication, or something Lady Ashby called a miscommunication. Verity had been summoned to the dining room to address an issue with Nella, who had told her mother at dinner that she needed the governess, and Nella did not know yet that there were rooms she was permitted to need the governess in, and rooms she was not. So Verity arrived in the dining room doorway at the moment the first course was being served, and 12 people were seated, and she was standing at the threshold in her grey wool dress with the mended collar, holding a child's hand. Lady Ashby looked at her across the length of the table. The look was not loud. Cruelty at that level of society was never loud. It was a long, specific look that communicated, without a word, the full taxonomy of Verity's inadequacy. That she was in a room she had no right to be in, that her presence at this threshold was an embarrassment to the household, that whatever Nella needed could wait until morning, and any competent governess would have known this without being told. Verity felt the look settle against her face like cold water. She did not flinch. She had learned not to flinch. "I beg your pardon," she said, her voice at its most neutral. "I will attend to Miss Nella upstairs." She put her hand on Nella's shoulder and turned. "Miss Lorne." The voice came from her right. She stopped. The Duke of Fenmore had risen from his chair. He had not. She noticed with the observational clarity that operated in her, even under the worst circumstances, made any performance of it. No theatrical gesture, no raised voice. He had simply stood, and the room had gone quiet the way. Rooms went quiet when significant men decided something was worth their attention. He was looking at Lady Ashby. "The child needs her governess," he said. "The child should have her governess." A pause, and Miss Lorne should have a chair at this table. The silence that followed. This was of a particular quality. Not shocked exactly. The word for it was reckoning. The sound of 12 people simultaneously revising their understanding of what was happening in this room. Lady Ashby's smile did not waver. She was very good at smiles.
"Your Grace is very kind," she said, "but the governess is the most competent person in this room," he said, still pleasantly, still in that register that contained no visible heat, but had the quality of something irrevocable.
"And I would be glad of her company at dinner, if she will honour us." He did not look at Verity when he said it. He kept his gaze on Lady Ashby. There was something precise about this. The way it removed choice from the architecture of the moment. He was not asking Verity. He was telling Lady Ashby. Lady Ashby held her smile for 3 more seconds. "Of course," she said, "if Miss Lorne would like to join us." Verity stood in the threshold with a hand on Nella's shoulder and the full weight of 12 people's attention on her face, and she understood several things at once. She understood that something had just happened that could not be undone. She understood that Lady Ashby's smile was the most dangerous thing in the room. She understood that the Duke of Fenmore had done this deliberately, not impulsively, not out of any passing gallantry, but as the opening move in something considerably longer. "Thank you," she said. "I will see Miss Nella settled first." She took Nella upstairs. She settled the child, who had fallen asleep before Verity reached the door. She stood in the corridor for 60 seconds and counted her breathing. Then she went back down. A chair had been placed at the table. Not at the foot, not at the far end. At the space to the Duke's left, which was the position that carried social weight he had arranged with the footman at some point in the previous 5 minutes. She sat. The soup was served. And she thought, eating it, that she was either watching the beginning of something extraordinary or the beginning of something catastrophic, and she genuinely could not tell which. He spoke to her at dinner, the way he spoke to anyone he found interesting, which was without condescension and without the particular careful courtesy that people extended to the governess when they wanted to seem broad-minded. He asked her opinion on things. He listened to her answers. He disagreed with her once about the administration of the Free Libraries Act, and he did it the way people disagree when they take the other person's argument seriously. At the far end of the table, Lady Ashby talked to Colonel Niles and did not look at the governess's chair, and kept her smile at exactly the correct pitch, which was the pitch of a woman who was calculating. When dinner concluded and the women withdrew, the Duke did not follow for precisely as long as social convention allowed, and then he followed, and he did not sit near Miss Forbes. He stood at the window. Verity was near the bookcase, because the bookcase was the defensive position in any drawing-room. He crossed to her. "You handled that well," he said, his back partly to the room, his voice at a register that did not carry. "I handle most things well," she said. "I am very practiced." He looked at her, not at the room, at her. "I know," he said. "I want to stop here because I know what you're thinking." "You're thinking, why did he wait? If he knew, if he had been watching for years, why wait? Why allow it to continue?" The answer is in the architecture of what he was building, because what happened at that dinner table, for all its weight, was theatre. It changed the room for one evening. It did not change the ledger, and the Duke of Fenmore was not interested in changing an evening. He was interested in the ledger, which is a different thing entirely, and requires considerably more patience to alter. He had begun 4 months prior with the mortgages. Larkmoor Hall sat on 3,000 acres of Yorkshire moorland, and its primary mortgage was held by a lending house in Leeds. The lending house in Leeds had found, 6 months ago, that their primary backer had sold their interest to a private buyer at market value, a transaction that was entirely unremarkable except that the private buyer was a trust administered by a solicitor in York who answered to the Duke of Fenmore. The second mortgage on the London townhouse had gone the same way 3 months after. Gerald Ashby did not know this. He would know it when the Duke chose to tell him. The parliamentary seat was more delicate. Gerald Ashby sat for Dunhaven, a constituency that contained, among other significant properties, 2 mills, a quarry, and the largest tenant farm in the riding, all of which were owned, managed, or closely connected to men who had attended Eton with Warwick Brambleton, and who would, if asked, remember that connection. He had not yet asked. Lady Ashby's reputation was the simplest part. He had, over the past year, ensured that he was present at 4 events, where her treatment of various household staff was visible to the kind of people whose opinions moved in the right circles. He had said nothing at any of them, but he had been seen to notice. He was building a case, not for a courtroom, for the only court that mattered in 1857 England, the court of social consequence. He intended to be thorough. The morning after the dinner, Verity received a note, not from him, from a solicitor she had never heard of in York, informing her that a sum of money had been placed in a private account in her name, and the account was hers without condition, and that the total was sufficient to live on for 3 years without employment. She sat with the note for a long time in the schoolroom, while Rosalba drew, and Nella practiced her scales in the next room. She was not a foolish woman. She knew where money placed in Governesses' accounts by anonymous solicitors came from. She knew also that money from that source placed her in a position she was not prepared to occupy, and that accepting it without understanding the terms was not something she was willing to do. She sent a reply to the solicitor she would not accept. She received a reply the following morning, The account existed, regardless of her acceptance. She could leave it untouched. It would wait. The morning after that, she encountered the Duke in the library again. "I sent the money back," she said. "You cannot send it back," he said. "It is yours. I don't accept money from men whose purposes I don't understand." He looked at her across the table. He had a way of looking at people that seemed, every time, to be arriving at something, not reaching, not searching, already there, and simply allowing the other person to catch up. "My purpose," he said, "is to ensure that Lady Ashby cannot threaten your survival. She cannot dismiss you without reference and destroy you, Miss Lorne. If you have resources she does not know about. The account is not a gift. It is a correction of an imbalance. Verity considered this. And what do you want for it? Nothing. Men do not put money in accounts for nothing. I want," he said carefully, "for you to be able to look Lady Ashby in the eye." He paused. "And possibly for you to continue meeting me in this library, which is the best conversation I've had in 2 years. She looked at him. He was not, she decided, lying, but she was not yet sure what he was telling the truth about. "I will think about it," she said. She kept the money. Not because she decided to trust him yet, but because she had spent 3 years being vulnerable to a woman who knew it. And the thought of that vulnerability removed, even silently, even in a way no one would ever see, made it possible to breathe in a way she had forgotten how to do. On the 5th day of the house party, Nella Ashby told her mother, with the 9-year-old's confident grasp of the incendiary, that the Duke of Fenmore had been in the library, talking to Miss Lorne for an hour that morning, and that Miss Lorne had laughed twice, and that the Duke had looked at Miss Lorne the way Papa sometimes looked at the horses he liked best, which was not, Nella felt, a very nice comparison, but it was the truest one she had. Lady Ashby's face, witnesses later reported, went through 3 distinct expressions in rapid succession. Then it settled into something that all of the witnesses recognized, and none of them chose to interrupt. She came to the schoolroom. At noon, Verity saw her coming. She had time to put her book down and stand, which was the appropriate posture for receiving Lady Ashby in her schoolroom, and to note that Lady Ashby had come alone without her usual social audience, which was the preparation for a different kind of conversation than usual. "Miss Lorne," Lady Ashby said. She came in and closed the door. She stood near the window, where the light was good. "I think you have been here long enough to understand how this house works." "I believe so, my lady." "Then you will understand that a governess who makes herself conspicuous to guests is a liability." "I was not aware that I had made myself conspicuous." "The Duke of Fenmore has been observed speaking with you on 3 occasions. Lady Ashby's voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant. "This kind of notice, for a woman in your position, creates a problem. Not for you, necessarily, but for this household, for my family's reputation." Verity said nothing. "I want to ensure we understand each other," Lady Ashby said. "Your employment here and your character depend on my satisfaction. Men like the Duke of Fenmore, they take notice of things and then they leave. And the governess they noticed is left here with the consequences." There it was, dressed in concern, delivered in that pleasant voice. The reminder of the reference letter, of the £26 a year, of the 6,200 and something days until Rosalba's 17th birthday, of everything that Lady Ashby held and could withdraw at any moment she chose. 3 years ago, this conversation would have felt like a wall. Today it felt like a test. "Thank you, my lady," Verity said. "I appreciate the guidance." Lady Ashby looked at her for a moment, looking for something some evidence of the fear she was accustomed to producing. Verity kept her face at the register she had perfected over years of practice, attentive, composed, giving nothing. "Good," Lady Ashby said. She withdrew. Verity sat down. She put her hands flat on the table. She was shaking, and she hated it, and she counted her breathing until she was not. Then she wrote a note to the solicitor in York, asking a series of questions about the account that she should have asked when the note first arrived, and which she now needed answered before she could understand what she was actually doing. She did not encounter him that day. She encountered him the following morning, at the turn of the servants' corridor, which was becoming a habit she was not entirely sure she should permit. "Lady Ashby came to see you," he said. Not a question. Yes, she kept walking. He walked with her. This was, she thought, an interesting choice for a man of his rank in someone else's house. To walk the servants' corridor rather than the main hall. What did she say? Verity stopped. She turned to face him in the narrow corridor, and she looked him with the full directness that she had been trained by 3 years of practice not to deploy on powerful men. "Your Grace," she said, "I appreciate what you did at dinner. I understand it was deliberate, and I am not unaware of the risk you extended on my behalf. But I need to understand what is happening here, and I need you to tell me plainly, because I am not in a position to misunderstand things." He looked at her for a moment. "Walk with me," he said. "Not here." He led her with the complete self-possession of someone who did not recognize architectural hierarchy as applying to himself, through the servants' corridor, which was out into the east garden. Light and entirely deserted. They walked to the far end of the kitchen garden, where a stone wall marked the boundary between the formal grounds and the working farm, and he stopped and looked at the moors, and she stood beside him and waited. "I have been watching this household for 4 months, he said. He said it the way a man states a fact he is not embarrassed by. "I have, in that time, acquired a position in relation to Gerald Ashby's financial obligations that gives me considerable leverage. I have also spent the preceding 2 years ensuring that Lady Ashby's treatment of her household staff is known in the circles that matter. None of this is complete. It is further along than you know." Verity regarded the moors. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I watched a woman carry a supper tray across an entrance hall," he said, with the particular dignity of a person who has decided that if no one else will give them back their self-possession, they will take it on their own. "And because I have spent my adult life surrounded by people who have everything and treat it as the minimum, and I find that I have very little patience left for cruelty that is permitted, 'tis simply because it is inconvenient to stop it." She was quiet. "That is not a complete answer," she said. "No," he agreed, "it isn't." The wind moved across the moors. A crow called somewhere to the south. "My complete answer," he said, "requires more time than we currently have to spend in a kitchen garden in October. But the part of it that matters for your present situation is this. I intend to ensure that Lady Ashby cannot harm you. The reference, the salary, the threat of dismissal, I intend to make all of those irrelevant. How precisely that happens depends on a conversation I need to have with Gerald Ashby, which I will have before the end of this week." Verity looked at the moors. "I am not someone's rescue," she said. "No," he said, "you are not." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with that expression she could not yet read, the one that felt less like evaluation than like recognition. "Then what are you proposing?" she said. "At present," he said, "I am proposing a conversation with Gerald Ashby. Beyond that, at present, I am not proposing anything beyond what you would find acceptable. When you are ready to find anything acceptable. I am patient, Miss Lorne. I have been patient for 4 months. I can continue. She looked at him for a long time.
You have been watching this household for 4 months, she said, and you did not contact me. No. Why? Because you were not yet in a position to hear anything I said without it sounding like interference from a man with power over your circumstances.
He paused. You are still not entirely in that position, but I think you are closer than you were. This was, she thought, the most precisely calibrated thing anyone had ever said to her. I am, she said. She walked back to the house. He walked past her and did not touch her and did not speak, and the silence was the most companionable thing she had experienced in 3 years. That afternoon, the Duke of Fenmore had a conversation with Gerald Ashby in the study. The details of that conversation were not witnessed. What was observed by the footman, who brought in the whisky and withdrew immediately, was that Mr. Ashby's face at the end of the conversation was the face of a man who has been very thoroughly shown a map of his own position and found it significantly less comfortable than he had believed. What was observed by Lady Ashby was that her husband came out of that study and looked at her with an expression she had not seen in 15 years of marriage, which was the expression of a man who has discovered that the thing he thought was his to decide has already been decided without him. Fenmore, Gerald Ashby told his wife that evening, wants the governess at table for the rest of the party. Lady Ashby's smile did not move. That is unusual, she said. That, Gerald Ashby said, is what I told him. A pause. He was not moved by that observation. Lady Ashby sat very still. Very well, she said. Verity was at the table that evening, and the next, and the one after that. Something changed, gradually, in the quality of the house party's attention to her. Not warmly. This was not a room of people who had been converted to anything, but with the particular careful recalibration that English society performed when it perceived that a social calculation had shifted. They did not know what had shifted. They knew only that the Duke of Fenmore spoke to the governess across the dinner table as though she were worth speaking to, and that Gerald Ashby had stopped looking at his wife when it happened, and that Lady Ashby's smile had acquired a quality none of them could name, but all of them could feel. Colonel Niles's wife, who was shrewd, said to Mrs. Drummond privately, "Something is happening, and I don't know what it is, but I think we should all be very careful." Mrs. Drummond agreed, and they left it at that. On the 7th evening there was dancing. Larkmoor's ballroom was not large, but it was adequate for 12 couples, and Lady Ashby had arranged it with the particular care of a hostess who intended the evening to produce a result. Specifically, the result of Miss Forbes and the Duke of Fenmore standing in a garden together long enough for an understanding to be reached. The Duke of Fenmore had not danced yet. He was standing near the window. He had a preference for windows, she had noticed, which allowed him to see the entire room while appearing to look at nothing, and Verity was near the pianoforte, because Mrs. Forbes had asked her to turn pages for the accompanist, which was the kind of task that rendered her simultaneously present and useful, and therefore permissible. She was turning pages. She was not watching him. She was lying to herself, and she knew it. Miss Lorne, she looked up. He was standing beside her. Behind him, in the middle distance, she could see Miss Forbes pause in her conversation, and the particular adjustment of her attention that meant she had noticed. "Your Grace," she said.
"I think you should know," he said, his voice at the private register she had come to identify as the one that meant he was not performing for the room, that I have been intending to ask you to dance since the music began, and I have been working out the correct sequence of events that allows me to do so without Lady Ashby making the next 3 days difficult for you." She looked at him.
"And have you worked it out?" "Not entirely," he said. "But I find I have run out of patience for working it out, and I thought you might prefer honesty." She looked at the room. 12 couples. Lady Ashby at the far end, watching everything. Miss Forbes, 23 and beautiful, who had done nothing wrong and was not to blame for her mother's arithmetic. The footmen in their livery. The candles. She thought about the account in York. She thought about what he had said in the kitchen garden. "I am patient, Miss Lorne. I can continue." "Ask me," she said. He held out his hand. The room, she was aware, reorganized itself around this moment, the way rooms do when something significant happens, and no one knows yet what to say about it. She put her hand in his, and he led her to the floor, and the dance began, and she was acutely aware that this was the first time she had danced in 4 years, and that she had not forgotten how. He was good at it, which she had expected. More than that, he danced with the quality of attention he brought to everything, which meant he was present in a way that most people at most dances were not, and she felt herself, incrementally and against her considered judgment, becoming present too. "Lady Ashby," she said, on the 3rd turn, "is looking at me as though she is working out the date of my dismissal." "She is not going to dismiss you," he said. "You cannot guarantee." "I can," he said. It was very simple. The way he said it was very simple. Not a boast. A fact about the structure of the situation, stated for her information. She looked at him. "What have you done?" "At present, what I have done is speak to Gerald Ashby about the structure of his financial obligations," he said, "and make clear that the continued comfort of those obligations depends, in part, on the continued comfort of his household staff." She missed a step. He caught it, without drawing attention to it. "That is," she said, "coercion." "It is," he agreed, "an arrangement of incentives. You cannot run a household on coercion." "I have no interest in running a household on coercion," he said. "I am interested at present in ensuring that a specific woman is not dismissed without reference in October of 1857. What happens to this household after that is outside my current concern." She looked at him. The dance required them to turn, and they turned, and his hand was warm through her glove. "Your Grace," she said, "I need you to understand something. Tell me." "I have spent 3 years learning to accept the terms of a very specific position," she said. "I have become very good at it, and I am aware that what you are doing is changing those terms without my having been consulted about at whether I want the terms changed." He was quiet for a full measure of the music. "That is fair," he said. "I am not asking you to stop," she said. "I am asking you to tell me everything, all of it. What you have done, and what you intend to do, and what you want, because the complete answer that you withheld in the kitchen garden. I need that answer now, or I cannot make any decision with any of this." He looked at her. "The complete answer," he said, "is that I intend to ask you to marry me. Not tonight, and not tomorrow, and not until you are in a position to consider the question without your present colouring the answer. But that is the complete answer, and I thought you should know what you are working with." Verity Lorne processed this information. The dance continued. They turned twice. The music moved from the bridge to the reprise. Lady Ashby's smile at the far end of the room went through a very small evolution that none of the other guests could have named. "That," Verity said finally, "is a very large piece of information." "Yes," he said. "I need to think about it." "I know," he said. "Take the time you need. I have been patient for 4 months. I can be patient for considerably longer. She thought about it as she had promised, for 3 days. She thought about it in the schoolroom while Rosavalba drew, and Nella quarrelled with her scales. She thought about it in the library on Friday morning, where he came and sat across the table from her, and they read for 2 hours in almost total silence, except for one passage of Tocqueville that she read aloud to him, and his response to it, which was the most engaged conversation she had had about political theory since her father's study had been a place she could sit without an appointment. She thought about the shape of the thing he was proposing, the fact of it, the reality of it, the 23-year-old girl's version of herself, who had never expected to be a governess and would have laughed at the idea that she might need to think carefully about a duke's proposal. She was not 23 anymore. She was 27, and she had spent 4 years learning the exact dimensions of what happened to educated women without money. And she was not a fool, and what the Duke of Fenmore was offering was not simply rescue. He had been very careful not to offer rescue. He was offering her a position from which she could make a decision that was actually hers to make, which was different, and she found she could not dismiss it. She also found, which was the part she had not expected and was not sure what to do with, that she had spent 8 days in a state of close and continuous attention to a man, and had not once had the experience of finding him smaller when she looked more carefully. Usually people reduced the closer you got to them. This one kept being exactly as large, she thought. This is dangerous information. On the 10th day of the house party, Lady Ashby held her signature afternoon entertainment, which was a dramatic reading in the drawing room, and which required all her guests to sit in careful arrangement, while she presided from the position of a woman who controlled what was read and who read it. She had selected for the readings that day a series of letters. Personal letters, she explained to the assembled guests, with the gracious expression of someone performing a charitable act. Letters that illustrated the character of various persons in their households, for the edification of all. Verity understood what was happening 6 sentences before any other person in the room. The first letter was addressed to a household in Leeds, inquiring about the character of one Miss V. Lorne. The response, read aloud by Lady Ashby's daughter, in the clear voice Lady Ashby had trained her to use, noted concerns about Miss Lorne's behaviour, her lack of appropriate professional distance, her tendency to form unsuitable relationships with members of households above her station. It was a lie, a specific, well-constructed lie, in someone else's handwriting, on stationery that Verity recognized as a family she had worked for, briefly and well, 2 years before Larkmoor. The room was quiet. Verity sat with her hands in her lap. She was aware of the stillness of the man 3 chairs to her left. She was aware of 12 faces in various states of carefully managed reaction. She was aware of Lady Ashby's gracious expression, which was a very precise kind of triumph. The governess's only weapon was her reference. This was what Lady Ashby was saying, without saying it. Without your reference, you are nothing. And your reference, I have just shown the room that I can shape it into whatever I need. Verity sat with her hands in her lap and breathed. Then the Duke of Fenmore stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not, in fact, do anything visually dramatic at all. He stood, and the room's attention reorganized around him, the way water reorganizes around something that enters it, and he looked at Lady Ashby, and he said, "I would like to see that letter." Lady Ashby said, "Your Grace, it is simply the letter Lady Ashby." A footman carried it to him. He read it. He read it carefully, at the speed of a man who reads everything carefully, and the room sat in the particular silence of 12 people who understood that a line has been crossed into territory. None of them had anticipated. Then he said, "This letter is dated the 14th of June, 1856. On the 14th of June, 1856, I was present at a function at Hartstone Manor in Wiltshire, at which Miss Lorne was employed as governess to the Hartstone children. I was introduced to Miss Lorne by Lady Hartstone, who spoke of her in terms I will not attempt to condense, because they are not the terms in this letter. Lady Hartstone also introduced her to 6 other guests, whose names I can provide, who can confirm that the characterization of Miss Lorne in this document is not the characterization Lady Hartstone gave in person on that day." A long silence. "I will be writing to Lady Hartstone tomorrow," he said. "I expect a reply within the week. In the meantime, I think it is important that everyone in this room understands that the document you have just heard is a forgery, and that the person responsible for it has made a significant error of judgment." He sat down. He did not look at Verity. He looked at Lady Ashby. The expression on Lady Ashby's face was not one that Lady Ashby permitted herself to wear in company. She permitted it now because she did not have, at this precise moment, sufficient control over her own face to prevent it. "I think," said Colonel Niles's wife into the silence, "that we might have some tea." The afternoon dissolved. Guests separated into small groups, the way guests do when something has happened that requires processing. Lady Ashby left the room with the expression of a woman who needs to sit alone and revise a great many calculations. Verity sat where she was. He came to her side when the room had thinned to 2 or 3 people, and he sat in the chair beside her, and he said very quietly, "Are you all right?" "No," she said. Because it was him, and she had decided, somewhere in the previous 10 days, that she was not going to perform her usual competence for him. "No," he agreed. "That was—" He stopped. She had never heard him stop himself before. "I should have seen it sooner. I should have anticipated." "You cannot anticipate everything." "I anticipate quite a lot," he said. And there was, in his voice, something she had not heard before. The particular quality of a person who is angry with themselves for a failure, not angry with the world. I had not accounted for her moving this quickly. She was running out of time, Verity said. The house party ends on Saturday. She looked at her hands. She knew it would. She decided to act before. She stopped. "Before I could protect the situation," he said. "Yes." They sat with that for a moment. "The letter is a forgery," she said. "You know that because of the date." "I know that because I have been collecting evidence of this particular variety of Lady Ashby's behaviour for a year," he said. "The date was convenient. The rest of it is careful documentation." She looked at him. He looked back. "You have been doing this for a year," she said. "Yes. How long? Have you been watching me?" He held her gaze. "The first time I was in the same room as you," he said, "was a garden party in 1855. You were governess to the Primrose children. You did not know I was there." A pause. "I asked after you the following day. I was told you had left the Primrose employment and taken a position in Yorkshire." Another pause. "I did not follow you there immediately. It took me several months to admit to myself that I was going to." Verity sat with this. 1855, she said. "Yes, that is 2 years. Yes." She looked at the window. The garden was grey and gold late afternoon. "You watched a woman carry a tray," she said, "at a garden party, and you spent 2 years. "Yes," he said. "That is," she said, and found she could not complete the sentence. "I know," he said, "it is a great deal. I am not asking you to receive it as less than it is. She thought about the library, the 2 hours in silence that were the most companionable silence she had experienced in years. The kitchen garden, the dance, the way he had stood and said, "The letter is a forgery." The way a man states a fact about the structure of the world. "I need to know one thing," she said. "Ask." If I said no, she said. If at the end of all this I said no, what happens to the Ashbys? What happens to the mortgages, the parliamentary seat, the letter to Lady Hartstone? He was quiet for a moment. "The letter to Lady Hartstone goes regardless," he said. "That is about the document, not about you." A pause. "The rest depends on what happens here over the next 3 days. I will not pretend that this situation is clean, but I will tell you that no part of what I have done was designed to obligate you. It was designed to give you options. The options exist whether or not you choose me." She looked at him. "That is," she said, "either very generous or very calculated." "It is both," he said. "I am not a simple man, Miss Lorne. I think you know that." "I do," she said. She rose. She needed to check on Rosalba. She needed to be in the schoolroom, which was the only room in this house that was entirely hers. "I have had 3 years of practice," she said at the door, "at making decisions in circumstances where every option is constrained. I am not unacquainted with calculating impossible things." She paused. "Give me until Saturday." She went upstairs. She sat with Rosalba that evening and read aloud, and Rosalba fell asleep, as she always did, and Verity sat in the schoolroom in the quiet. She did not think about him. She tried not to think about him. This was not successful, but the effort had value. It showed her the precise dimensions of the problem. She could not think about what he had said without thinking about the way he had said it, and she could not think about the way he had said it without thinking about the corridor and the library and the dance and the kitchen garden, and she could not think about any of those without arriving at the same difficulty, which was that she had spent 3 years in a house that had required her to make herself small, and she could not determine whether what she felt for this man was genuine, or whether it was simply the profound relief of being seen by someone who could actually do something about what he saw. This was not a small distinction. This was, in fact, the entire question. She blew out the lamp. She lay in her narrow bed in the cold room and listened to the house and thought, "I have been managing impossible circumstances for so long that I have forgotten what it would feel like to stop managing." She thought, "I think I would like to find out." In the 3 days that followed, he did not seek her out. He was in the dining room at dinner, 3 chairs away. He was in the drawing room after, near the window where he always stood. He was in the corridor on Thursday morning, very briefly, and they passed each other without speaking, and she felt his gaze on the side of her face the way you feel the heat of a fire in a room. Present, specific, giving nothing except its warmth. He did not come to the library on Thursday. She sat with Tocqueville for 2 hours and read the same section 4 times and understood nothing and went back to the schoolroom. This was fine. This was what she had asked for. Time. She had asked for time. Rosalba noticed on Thursday evening. "You've been very quiet," Rosalba said from behind her Norse mythology. "I am always quiet," Verity said. "You have been differently quiet." Rosalba turned a page with the someone who has she had said the important thing and will allow others to sit with it. On Friday morning, Verity went to the library and he was already there, which she had both expected and not expected, and they read for 2 hours in almost total silence, except for one passage of Tocqueville that she read aloud to him and his response to it, which was the most engaged conversation she had had about political theory, since her father's study had been a place she could sit without an appointment. When the 2 hours were done, she went to close her book, and he said, without looking up from his own, "You do not have to decide today." She looked at the top of his head. His attention was still on the page, or performing the appearance of it. "I know," she said. "I am not." He stopped. He set his book down. He looked at the table for a moment. "I am aware that I have put a considerable amount in front of you. The history of it, the scale of what I've arranged. I am aware that it could feel like, that it might make it harder to know what you actually want, rather than what the situation seems to require." She watched him. This was the most he had ever spoken about his own uncertainty. She understood, watching him, that this small admission had cost him something measurable. "I know what I want," she said. He looked at her then. "I am not yet ready to say it," she said, "but I know what it is." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he picked up his book. She thought, "This is dangerous information." On Friday morning, she went to the library. He was already there. She sat across the table from him. She did not open a book. "I have thought about it," she said. He waited. She had expected him to say something. A word of acknowledgement. Some signal that he had been waiting too. He said nothing. He simply looked at her, and the quality of the silence told her everything that 3 days of thinking had not. That whatever this cost him, he had decided not to show her until she was ready to see it. "I have 3 conditions," she said. "Tell me." "Rosalba," she said, "her education does not end because I leave. If I leave, I want your commitment that her education will be continued by someone with the relevant qualifications and the genuine interest in the work. Not a woman hired because she is inexpensive or because she will be compliant. Someone who will recognize what Rosalba is." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man deciding, the quiet of a man who has already decided and is choosing how to say it. "I know a woman in Edinburgh," he said. "She taught at a school for 7 years before her husband's death left her needing a position. She has Greek and Latin, which Rosalba will want in 2 years. I will write to her this afternoon." Verity looked at him. He had already been thinking about Rosalba. He had been thinking about Rosalba before she raised it. She filed this away. "The reference," she said. "Lady Ashby will not simply allow this to end cleanly. Whatever the letter to Lady Heartstone produces, I want the matter of my character formally resolved, not quietly managed, not set aside. Resolved. I intend," he said, to send copies of Lady Heartstone when it arrives to every household in the northern counties that employs a governess, and to 3 of the most widely read women in London society. Your name will be cleared in writing, in their handwriting, not mine." He paused. "They will know it came from me. That is the point." She absorbed this, the scale of it, the specific machinery of it. "And third," she said. She stopped. He watched her find the words, and he did not fill the silence. And this was, she thought, the most respectful thing anyone had done for her in 4 years. "Third," she said, "I have done things quietly for 3 years because I had no other option. I have kept my eyes at a point left of people's faces and said, 'Yes, my lady,' and walked away from rooms still employed, and I am very good at it, and I am finished with it. I need to know, not that you will tolerate my directness, that you understand it is not a thing I am capable of putting away." He was still. Then he said, "When you told me in the corridor that you were not in a position to misunderstand things, do you know what I thought?" She waited. "I thought, there she is." He looked at the table for a moment. The first time, she realized, that he had looked away from her in this conversation. "I have been in rooms with very clever people all my adult life. I have been in rooms with people who held enormous power. I have never been in a room with someone who could strip a situation to its structure that completely, in 7 words, under the conditions you were under. He looked back at her. I am not asking you to be manageable. I would not know what to do with someone manageable. I would find it intolerable within a fortnight. The corner of his mouth moved, the first time she had seen that, the very first time she looked at him. He looked back. Yes, she said. The word landed between them like something set down after a long carry. He did not move toward her. He did not reach across the table. He sat with the yes, as though he needed a moment to receive it properly. And she understood, watching him, that the patience he had extended for 2 years had not been effortless. It had been chosen every day at some cost. She was only beginning to see. I am going to speak to Lady Ashby this morning, he said. His voice was even, entirely even. But something in it was different from every other time he had spoken in this room, and she could not have said what it was, except that it was not performance. What will you tell her? That Miss Lorne is leaving this employment on Monday, and that the terms of her departure are my concern, not Lady Ashby's. She thought about this. She will be vindicated, Verity said, in her own mind. She will believe she has won. She will believe it until Tuesday, he said, when she learns what I have arranged for the mortgages. Verity looked at him. I told you, he said, that I have been building a case. I am going to speak to Lady Ashby's this morning, he said. What will you tell her? That Miss Lorne is leaving this employment on Monday, he said, and that the terms of her departure are my concern, not Lady Ashby's. She thought about this. She will be vindicated, Verity said, in her own mind. She will believe she has won. She will believe it until Tuesday, he said, when she learns what I have arranged for the mortgages. Verity looked at him. I told you, he said, that I have been building a case. He had Lady Ashby's conversation at 10 o'clock, and Gerald Ashby's at 11, and by noon the specific sound of Larkmoor Hall had changed. Not dramatically, not in any way most guests would have noticed, but in the particular barometric register of a household that has understood that something has shifted in its foundation and does not yet know what to do about the shift. Lady Ashby came to Verity's room at 2 o'clock. She came alone, which was unusual. She stood in the doorway of the small, cold room up above the servants' quarters, with its narrow bed and its single window overlooking the kitchen garden, and she looked at Verity with an expression that was not, for once, performing anything. He is serious, she said. Yes, Verity said, a long pause. I had believed, Lady Ashby said, that men like Fenmore did not. She stopped. She pressed her lips together. That is irrelevant. Yes, Verity said. Your month's salary will be settled by Monday, Lady Ashby said, and a reference will be prepared. Thank you, my lady. Lady Ashby looked at her for one more moment. And then she did something Verity had never seen her do. She looked away first. The last full day of the house party was a Saturday. The Duke of Fenmore did not depart with the other guests. He remained, with Gerald Ashby's strained agreement, while the carriages were loaded and the footman managed the departure of 9 guests, all of whom had revised their social calculations in the past 48 hours into something that bore very little resemblance to what they had arrived with. Millicent Forbes, departing in her mother's carriage, looked out the window at Verity standing in the drive. She was 23 years old and beautiful, and had done nothing wrong. She had been brought to Larkmoor by a mother who understood the mathematics of marriage as a commercial transaction, and she had executed her part in that transaction
with the diligence and grace she had been trained to perform since childhood.
She had not been unkind to the governess. She had not even been dismissive, not truly. She had simply been unable to imagine a world in which the governess was a category of person whose existence required acknowledgement. Because no one had ever shown her such a world. Verity understood all of this in the moment their eyes met through the carriage window. Miss Forbes held her gaze for a beat longer than she needed to. Then she nodded. It was not the nod of a woman conceding defeat. It was the nod of a woman who had seen something she would be thinking about for considerably longer than this drive home. Something that had shifted the architecture of a room she had believed she understood. It was, Verity thought, the nod of a woman who was, in some small and tentative way, starting to understand that the mathematics she had been given might not be the only mathematics available. Verity nodded back. The carriage moved. Verity watched it until it reached the bend in the drive and disappeared behind the elm trees. And she thought about Millicent Forbes returning to London for another season, with her mother's calculations and her own grace. And she hoped, with a specificity that surprised her, that the woman found something better than what she had been taught to want. When the last carriage had gone, the Duke came to stand beside her. "Gerald Ashby," he said, "has requested a meeting with his solicitor next week. He will find the meeting uncomfortable. The mortgages, among other things." He paused. "I want to be clear about what happens next. The mortgages will not be foreclosed. The parliamentary seat will not be removed. Lady Ashby will be informed, through appropriate channels, that the matter of the forged letter is being handled directly, and that the handling has been observed by people whose opinion matters. The Ashbys will be uncomfortable for a period of time, and they will understand why, and they will not harm you. That seems," she said, "measured." "I am trying," he said, "to resist the less measured version." She looked at him. "What is the less measured version?" He looked at the moors. The light was going. October went early in Yorkshire. "The less measured version," he said, "is considerably more total. I have the capacity to make Gerald Ashby's life profoundly difficult in ways that would follow the family for a generation. I am choosing not to deploy that capacity." "Why?" He turned to look at her. "Because you told me," he said, "that you are not someone's rescue, and the less measured version is a rescue. The measured version is a correction." She understood the difference. She thought about the account in York, not a gift, but a correction of an imbalance. "I will leave Monday," she said. "Yes, where am I going?" He looked at her. There was in his face a quality she recognized from the best moments of her father's company. The quality of a man who finds you genuinely interesting. "Wherever you want," he said. "There are properties. You can choose, or London, or abroad if you prefer to travel before." He stopped. "Before I decide," she said. "Yes." She looked at the moors. The light was going fast. "I have already decided," she said. He was very still. 2 years, she said. "You watched a woman carry a tray, and you spent 2 years making sure she had options. I have spent 3 years in a house that told me every day that I was worth exactly as much as it needed me to be, and no more." She paused. "I know what is to be seen by someone who is simply waiting for the time to be right. And I know, which is the part I did not expect, what it feels like when the thing you were waiting for turns out to be worth the wait." He looked at her for a long time. "Verity," he said. Her name for the first time. Not Miss Lorne, not a formal register. Just her name in his voice, which was very quiet. "Yes," she said. He took her hand, not as he had taken it for the dance, with the formal lift and arrangement of a waltz. He simply took her hand and held it, and they stood together in the drive of Larkmoor Hall, while the October light went and the moors went dark, and the house behind them rearranged itself around an absence it had not yet finished calculating. Now, I want to tell you what happened next, because the story does not end in a drive in October. The letter to Lady Heartstone was sent. Lady Heartstone's reply arrived within 5 days. The reply was extremely clear. The character given for Miss Verity Lorne in any document bearing Lady Heartstone's name, and dated June 1856, was not a character Lady Heartstone had written, and the suggestion that she had was libellous, and her solicitor was preparing to address this at the appropriate level. The relevant letters were shared through the Duke of Fenmore's particular network of appropriate channels, with approximately 12 people whose opinions shaped the social landscape in which the Ashby family moved. Those 12 people shared them with others, because social information moves at exactly the speed that suits it. And within 3 weeks, the Ashby family understood the shape of the world they were now living in. Verity was not there to see it.
She was, by then, in London, in rooms in Mayfair that were warm and well appointed, and in which she had spent the first 3 days simply sitting in chairs that were comfortable, doing nothing, discovering that she had forgotten what nothing felt like.
The engagement was announced 6 weeks after the house party. The announcement was brief and factual, as announcements in 1857 were. What was not brief was the reaction, because London society, which had spent 3 years building a very specific understanding of what the Duke of Fenmore intended to do with his title, found itself required to revise that understanding comprehensively. What people noticed later was the dinner.
The first dinner the Duchess of Fenmore attended, not as a governess carrying a tray, not as a charity case permitted to the table, but as the woman who held the highest social position in the room, was held at Caldwell Park, which the Duke had acquired in the autumn, and which contained among its guest list 6 people who had been present at Larkmoor Hall's house party in October.
Lady Ashby was among them. The Duke had chosen specifically to invite Lady Ashby because the Duke of Fenmore was thorough. Verity stood at the top of the staircase before descending, and she held the banister, and she breathed. She was wearing a gown the colour of deep water, not blue exactly, not green exactly, the colour of the sea when it is thinking about a storm. The woman who had dressed her had dressed duchesses for 30 years, and had not said a word about the scar on Verity's left hand from a childhood fall, had not commented on the slight irregularity of her left cuff, where she had mended it herself 3 years prior, had simply dressed her as though she was the thing she now was, and this alone had taken Verity 20 minutes to process. She looked down the staircase. The entrance hall of Caldwell Park was lit by 40 candles in a chandelier. She did not yet know the history of, and the light they cast was the colour of old gold, and in that light she could see through the open doors of the drawing-room the shapes of people who had watched her be invisible and had chosen to look away. She could see the particular set of a woman's shoulders near the fireplace that she would have recognized at any distance, in any light, in any room. Lady Ashby, in grey silk, holding a glass, attended by her husband's discomfort. Verity descended the staircase. She was aware of the moment the drawing-room registered her arrival. Not because anyone spoke, because the room performed the particular collective adjustment it performs when something enters it that does not fit the category it had been assigned. She was not the governess. She was not even quite the Duke's wife. Not yet. Not in the room's full understanding. She was something it had no existing name for, and the adjustment of that naming was visible in the room's silence as she crossed the threshold. He was near the window. He was always near the window. He turned before she reached him, which meant he had heard the quality of the room change and known the reason before he looked. He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze. She was not performing steadiness. She was steady, which is different, and it had cost her the better part of 4 years to get there. He crossed to her. He did not touch her. He simply stood beside her, and not. The room rearranged itself around this proximity, this two-person geography that had no precedent in any social calculation any guest had arrived with. Lady Ashby was near the fireplace. Their eyes met across the room. Verity had spent 3 years training her gaze to land slightly left of Lady Ashby's face. She had done it so automatically that it had become, over time, less a choice than a reflex, the body adapting to the cost of confrontation by simply routing around it. She did not root around it now. She looked at Lady Ashby directly, fully, with the specific quality of attention she had always possessed and had always been required to suppress, the attention of a woman who saw everything in a room and had learned, out of necessity, to pretend she saw nothing. Lady Ashby held the look for 3 seconds, 4, 5. Then her gaze dropped to her glass. Verity turned away. Not because she had won something, because there was nothing left there worth staying for. She turned toward the room, toward its candlelight and its arrangements and its careful social calculations. And she thought about the fact that she had occupied this house for 6 weeks and knew which floorboard creaked outside the study, and which chimney smoked in cold weather, and which chair near the library fire was the warmest. And she thought, I live here now. This is mine. The thought was extraordinary. She sat with it quietly. The way you sit with something extraordinary, so that it does not startle itself away. At dinner, the footman opened the doors to the dining room. She was standing beside her husband. She had heard this described. The way the room's precedence worked, the order of it, the choreography of position. She understood it intellectually. She had not understood, until this moment, what it would feel like in the body. He offered his arm. She took it. They moved toward the dining room doors, and the room moved with them. Not behind them, not after them, but with them. In the rearranging of 23 people who understood, in that moment, the structure of the evening's geometry. He stopped. She felt him stop and looked at him. He was looking at the room. Then he turned to face it, and she turned with him, and he held her gaze for 1 moment. The private register, the one that did not perform for anyone. And then he looked at the assembled guests, and he stood. He simply stood. The first person to rise was Colonel Niles, which surprised her. She had not thought him capable of leading anything. He stood, and then his wife, and then Mr. and Mrs. Drummond, and then the Prentices, and then the rest, and then Gerald Ashby, who was last, who stood with the expression of a man executing a duty he had not chosen and could not refuse. Lady Ashby stood. She stood because everyone else had stood, and because not standing would have been a declaration she did not have the courage to make. And because 20 people in this room would carry the story of this evening back to London, and she understood, standing, what story it would be. The room was on its feet. Verity looked at it. She looked at the 23 people standing in the candlelight of a dining room in a house she now lived in, and she felt something happen in her chest that was not triumph exactly. Triumph was too simple. This was the specific feeling of a weight that has been carried so long it has become part of the body's architecture, lifting, not suddenly, not all at once, but in the particular gradual way of something that has been attached for a very long time, and is only now, carefully, being released. She had carried the weight of 26 pounds a year and a cold room, and a gaze held slightly left. And yes, my lady, and the counting of days, until Rosalba's 17th birthday. She had carried it for 3 years and 4 months, and she had carried it with the particular economy of a person who does not waste grief. And she would carry some of it always, because that is what 3 years and 4 months does to a body. But not tonight. Tonight she walked to the chair he held. Her chair at this table in this house, in a life she had not been able to imagine 12 weeks ago. And she sat, and the room sat with her, and the candlelight moved across the silver and the crystal and the faces of people who had watched her be invisible and who would never watch her be invisible again. She looked once at the length of the table. Lady Ashby sat at its far end, in a position of considerable social diminishment, between the Drummond wife on one side, and an empty space on the other where Gerald Ashby had not yet been seated. She held her posture correctly. She would always hold her posture correctly.
But the expression below the posture was the expression of a woman who has understood that the thing she believed she was controlling has been building something else entirely, and the something else has arrived, and it is considerably larger than she anticipated.
Verity held her gaze for one breath, just one, long enough to be certain it had been received. Then she turned to the man beside her. He was looking at her with the patience of a man who has been waiting for exactly this, and finds it, now that it has arrived, exactly what he expected. Not surprised, not triumphant, arrived. The word for what was in his face was arrived. The quality of a person who has been in transit for a very long time, and has at last reached the place they were always moving toward. She thought of the entrance hall at Larkmoor. She thought of a woman crossing it with a supper tray. Alone, at 11 o'clock at night, in a house of 40 rooms. She thought of a man standing in the east corridor above, watching her, making the sounds of a man who was listening to someone else, while every particle of his attention went with her down the hall and around the corner. 2 years, 4 months, 3 years and 4 months on her side. All of it had been moving toward this room, this chair, this light. She picked up her glass. She looked at him over the rim of it. She smiled. He said nothing. He simply looked at her, the way he had been looking at her since a garden party in 1855. But without the careful management of it now, without the restraint he had held for 2 years. He looked at her the way a man looks when he has stopped deciding how much of himself to show. "Well," she said, very quietly, only for him. "Well," he agreed, and the dinner began. I have to stop before the outro, because there is a moment in this story I keep returning to. Not the dinner, though the dinner is the one I am most proud of writing. Not the dance. The library on Friday morning, him setting down his book and saying, "I am aware that it could feel like, that it might make it harder to know what you actually want, rather than what the situation seems to require." That admission. The fact that he had 2 years of patience and 4 months of preparation, and the most precise social architecture I have ever put a fictional man inside, and the thing that cracked it open was simply, "I am afraid that what I have done has made it harder for you to choose freely." The most powerful man in this story, worried about the weight of his own power. That is, I think, what separates obsession from possession. He built all of it, and then asked if it was too much. Thank you for spending this time with me. Stories like this remind me why I make these. That feeling of watching someone be finally seen, properly, completely seen, after everything. The long patience of it, the architecture of what he built, not to rescue her, but to give her options. I hope you felt it. Drop a comment telling me the moment that got you. And if you have not subscribed yet, come join us. I would love to have you here for the next story. Until then, take care of yourselves.